Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says his government supports the United Nations top court, but that doesn't mean it supports the premise of the genocide claim brought by South Africa against Israel.
Canada right now is directly engaged in at least 5 different cases at the ICJ because we believe in the importance of that as an institution. But our wholehearted support of the ICJ and its processes does not mean that we support the premise of the case brought forward by South Africa.
In a statement today, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly echoed the Prime Minister, going on to say, "We will follow the proceedings of South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice very closely." This statement comes after days of questioning about where Canada stands on this case. Hearings in that case continued in The Hague today, where Israel rejected what it called grossly distorted allegations of genocide. South Africa made its case yesterday, accusing Israel of genocidal intent in Gaza, accusations that conservative leader Pierre Poilievre called a shameless attack against Israel.
I find it incredible that these countries have not accused Hamas of genocide. Of course, because this is not about genocide, it is about shamelessly and dishonestly attacking the Jewish people and the Jewish state.
Okay, to break down Canada's response, I'm joined now by Louise Blais. She's the former Canadian Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And I also have Roland. He is the Director of the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and he previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Nice to see you both. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Louise, I was waiting for this statement to come out to give me explicit clarity on where Canada stood, and I still have some questions as to what Canada's position is. What do you make of the statement from the government today?
Well, I think it was a very balanced statement, probably came a little late, but it basically says, look, the ICJ is an international body that we respect. We don't believe the premise, but the government's leaving the door open to accept potentially a ruling by the court that would go against the initial position of Canada. So it was balanced, it was well calculated, probably came a little late.
Roland, how do you see it? Because while they say they don't necessarily accept the premise of South Africa, they don't explicitly reject it either. How do you read this?
Yeah, David, I noticed that too. I mean, for starters, listen, there are plenty of reasons to find the situation in Gaza appalling. But one can find that appalling and also be appalled by the idea of accusing Israel of having a policy of exterminating the Palestinian people, which is essentially the charge of genocide. I'm glad the government said that it did not necessarily support that premise. But as you just pointed out, it's a curious phrasing because it goes on to say, you know, the threshold of evidence is very high. They didn't reject the premise. They said they don't necessarily support it. Germany today said there was no basis whatsoever, Germany, mind you, for this allegation. So Canada's statement was not as clear as that.
So Louise, on that, what do you make of sort of the absence of an explicit rejection? Why do you think Canada I know Canada is always a champion of multilateral institutions, and I understand that motivation. But why do you think they chose not to explicitly reject the allegation?
Well, it definitely was a middle ground approach. It sits in between France, for example, that basically say they will await the decision of the court without qualifying it any further. And yet, on the other hand, we're not condemning the accusation as completely baseless. So the language is very well, carefully drafted. Clearly, we get a sense that the government is under enormous domestic pressure, and as well as international. South Africa is a member of the BRICS. There are geopolitical movements around the world. Canada is trying to position itself to be able to, get along. As you heard, the minister has talked about a pragmatic foreign policy. So I think what I'm reading into the statement is that it is really a middle ground position that perhaps was there to please everyone, but will not please everyone. Will please no one, I think. And that's really, in a way, that's the UN. When everyone is unhappy with the decision, it's usually a good sign. So it means that you've had a compromise. And I think it was a compromise today.
Okay, I want to turn back to what you said about domestic considerations in just a second. But first, Roland, you mentioned Germany. Louise has mentioned that Germany came out. They're going to intervene, and they oppose this. France says it's going to wait for the decision, as Louise said. The Americans have obviously dismissed this, and the UK said it's completely unjustified and wrong, the allegations made by South Africa. Is there any kind of risk here for Canada for being offside with the US, the UK, and Germany on something as significant as this, or is this acceptable deviation in diplomatic circles?
Well, people in the Middle East aren't waking up in the morning waiting to hear what Canada's latest statement is, but it's incumbent on us to think through these positions very carefully and take the correct position. This charge of genocide is scurrilous, and it should be called scurrilous. Now, that doesn't take away from the very serious considerations about Israel's response to the October 7th attacks. I think that there are strong grounds to suggest that Israel's response has been disproportionate. That's serious enough. But let's keep something in mind as we're thinking about geopolitics and South Africa and the BRICS, et cetera. South Africa is a country that never condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On October 7th, South Africa's official statement effectively blamed Israeli actions for Hamas's murderous rampage. So there's something going on here, and pleasing everyone might end up pleasing nobody, I think, as Louise said.
But, Louise, as Roland just said, the Arab world is not lying awake, wondering what Canada is going to say. But this was a statement that a lot of Canadians wanted to hear, right? There were big domestic considerations and concerns that went into crafting this. How do you think that may have played into the position and the statement that the Canada put out today?
Well, I think very much you got the sense that the government took the time to hear from different constituencies, sorry. And I think they were really, in a way, probably they could have gone with a bureaucratic response a week, 2 weeks ago, with basically a legal approach to this. But this became political. It's clear, even in the Liberal Party, there are two different views on this. I get the sense that they really took their time. They heard both sides, and they decided to just go with a very nuanced response. And as you read in the statement today that the minister put out, it's the reiteration of the policy. And we've seen this as well with the joint statement with New Zealand and Australia. The government is going out of its way to really try to present to the Canadian public, as well as the international community, the fullness of our position. And we're trying not to get trapped into saying yay or nay on any specific step along the way.
Roland, I know you're a foreign policy expert, and that's why we have you here, but I'm just wondering on that point, how do you think that sort of the diaspora politics and the domestic politics might play into, when you're crafting a statement on a key foreign policy issue like this one?
Well, listen, I don't know what the internal discussion was, and I have no reason to doubt what Louise just said, which was that there was a lot of consultation. There was an attempt to find some kind of middle ground. But listen, sometimes governing is not just finding what the lowest common denominator position is. Sometimes it's saying this charge of genocide is scurrilous and wrong, and leadership is facing down elements within your own party who might think otherwise, and just saying, listen, Canada's position is that this is wrong and we reject it. And I think this was an instance where it would have made sense for Canada to take a clearer position.
Louise, how do you think that would have been received had Canada done as Roland? I'm assuming this would have been his advice, were he back in his old job as foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister. How do you think a position like that would have gone over?
Well, that would have been, in a way, that response would have been what the international community would have expected, given our track record of support for Israel. That wouldn't have been a surprise. It would have been just what they have seen for several decades now. I don't imagine that it would have been a much higher price to pay internationally, because that's where we've been situating ourselves. Domestically, it might have been a different story. I'm not a political expert,
Sure.
domestic political expert, but from the international community point of view, I think this is fairly neutral, one way or the other. I think it will be a long time until the rest of the international community feels that we've we've moved on our positioning on Israel. We're fairly consistent, and these nuances, I don't think will change their mind. But yes, I think for the Canadian public, it was probably, I think, a little bit more nuanced in what they felt they needed to do politically.
Roland, on that point, Louise describes it as neutral. How do you think the international community will view this in terms of Canada's historic position of siding with Israel, and of the Conservatives, for example, saying that, flat out rejecting the case brought by South Africa?
Well, listen, I don't think that this is a significant departure from Canada's position. It is supportive of Israel. It does say, even this statement effectively says that Hamas has genocidal intent, and that Canada doesn't accept that premise with regard to Israel. So it's just that, this is a moment where I think you're seeing a perversion of international law when there are real international law issues to be addressed in this conflict. And the significant one is the extent to which Israel's response and its actions in Gaza have been proportionate. There are international laws of war, and I think that Israel has been resisting pressure from its allies, including from the United States, to calibrate its response. It does have a right to defend itself. That's where the attention should be focused, not on these kind of scurrilous allegations that are frankly, they're offensive, because it's accusing Jews of what they were subjected to during the Holocaust. So let's focus back on what's real, which is this question of Israel's behavior in Gaza in relation to the distinction and proportionality and dealing with the catastrophe that's taking place in that territory right now.
Well, yes, and just as a final point, both Israel's actions in Gaza and the actions of Hamas are being looked at by the International Criminal Court, which is where those are dealt with. This is the ICJ is about state-to-state disputes, right? I mean, does that satisfy that standard for you, Roland? Yeah.
But
yes,
that's correct.
Except.
Okay, Louise, Louise, then Roland, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah.
Just to jump in, no, absolutely. I think this is, I agree completely with Roland that it is pushing it a little bit far to be bringing in genocide accusation against Israel. But it is an attempt on the international community, the majority of the international community probably, to actually use the UN system to bring an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people, and mostly, the civilians. So they're going after a decision, a provisional measure decision to put pressure on Israel to, if not stop completely, adapt its military impact. Yes, then there could be a case that will take years, but I think the intent is more short-term at the moment. And this was one of the mechanisms that was open to the international community, and they've decided to use it.
No, that's a very good point. Roland, a final point for you.
Well, 2 wrongs or 3 or 5 wrongs don't make a right. But wouldn't it be nice to see the same level of outrage from some of these countries about Hamas's behavior, or about the slaughter of Arab civilians in other countries in the Middle East, or about Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine? It is curious. And I think that those who say that Israel is subject to disproportionate, strange attention in these matters, that there's something there. That does not take away from the fact that there is something that is really disturbing taking place in Gaza. Both of these things can be true at the same time, David.
Louise Blais and Roland Paris, thank you so much for your time tonight. Appreciate it.